Great. Thank you, Brian, and welcome everybody. So as Brian mentioned, today we'll be speaking a little bit about Maximo Spatial 7.6, and we'll actually have a demonstration of the product, and we have the latest FixPack 7.601 that is available. So our agenda today is to talk about the configurations, talk about some new applications that are available with Maximo 7.6, and features and functionality specifically around the synchronization of data between Maximo and GIS, or GIS and Maximo. There will be live demonstration as I go through the presentation, and as Brian mentioned, at the end of it, we will have a Q&A period. So we're going to start off with the Map Manager application that is provided when you install Maximo Spatial. I guess one of the good news is for those that are possibly upgrading from Maximo Spatial 7.5 is that there's now only one Map Manager application. In previous versions or releases, there was one for Scheduler, there was one for the core, and then there was one for the Map Manager for Spatial. So that's all been consolidated. There's now one application that you manage your maps for your sites. You'll have the ability to add layers to your map, and one of the new features that have been added in this is the ability to create the GIS object, create the relationships, as well as bring in any of the domains that may exist in the GIS system or system of record. This is a new feature that's been added in the 7.6 release. This helps reduce the administrative time and the time that individuals would have to take to create the objects, to create the relationships, define the attributes, and all that, which was cumbersome in many, many cases. Here you can just see a couple of screenshots that when you define on a layer an object name, the object, Maximo object, such as an asset record or the asset object, the system of record, and you simply hit the execute GIS configuration, and then it goes through and runs a number of different processes. Ultimately, at the bottom here, in the image there, is you'll see that the relationship is created along with the object, and then the GIS resource, or the REST URL that it's going to use. So what's happening in the background when you click on that button? So as I mentioned, the GIS object is created. This is the object that the name that you specify, and any of the attributes for the target system, in this case, the Esri GIS system. A relationship is created between Maximo and the GIS system, and the relationship will begin with spatial underscore and then the object name. So in our case, we may have GIS schools as one of those, and we'll talk about different types of objects that we're going to be creating today. An endpoint and a JSON resource is created. So an endpoint in Maximo is utilized from an integration framework perspective, and JSON is new capability that's been introduced with Maximo 7.6 that the scheduling, or not the scheduling, my apologies, the spatial application is leveraging to synchronize the data between systems. And again, one of the other things that I mentioned is in ArcGIS, you do have domains against many of your fields and attributes. Those domains will be synchronized once you initiate the creation of the object. Now, this is a one-time load. This is if the domains change in the GIS system, you'll have to maintain them separately inside of Maximo currently. However, it is a nice way to maintain that relationship and keeping those domains up to speed. So let's jump over here to Maximo. I'm just going to log in. And I'm using one of my client sites today. And thank you to the town of Richmond Hill for allowing me to demonstrate using their system. Just going to fix the... Okay. So we'll go over here, and if we go to administration, now we'll see only one Map Manager application. So it's no longer Map Manager Spatial or Map Manager. We have one single application. So once we go into that application, you typically define a map, what that map is for, the length and distance unit, hence we're in Canada, so we're using kilometers, and then the site that particular map is going to be leveraged in, and it's currently enabled for this site. There are different providers that you can select. We're going to be using Maximo Spatial today, which means that we are connecting with the Esri ArcGIS server. However, you can accomplish similar capabilities with either Bing Maps or Google Maps. By selecting the appropriate provider, certain fields will conditionally be enabled or disabled. So here we've defined a site, and I've also defined my zoom level along with a latitude and longitude. This just helps when I go to the map tab or the map capabilities within the assets, locations, work order, service request application, this will just zoom in into the middle of the town so that people can then start from there and then find the appropriate assets. This is only used when a record is not linked when you're going to the map tab. We have some other options here. In 7.6, there is security capabilities. When you enable the security capabilities, you'll be providing token-based security or OAuth 2.0. You'll be providing a name and a password, and then that will apply across your services. Or if you only have certain services or map services defined, then you have the ability to define the security at the service layer if you enable it. Now, in our particular instance, we've defined one map service, and within that map service, we have many layers that are displaying different levels of features. There are many approaches that you can take when defining a map service. You may have seen previous demonstrations where you see that they may separate an asset point from an asset line from an asset polygon. There really is no recommended method. It's what works best for an organization. In this particular organization, is they prefer to handle one map service and all the layers within that. One of the drawbacks is, however, is anytime that you add a new map layer, and if the map layer needs to change the order, then you will have to go back and manipulate or change that data. So here we have a number of layers. We've got 47 layers defined within this map service. There are two layers that we're going to talk about today or demonstrate. One will be the hydrant layer, and the other one will be park open spaces. Fix up my browser here. Yeah. So typically when you're creating a new layer, there's a new row button. You would provide it a object name. In this case, we call it GIS_water_hydrant. We define the system of record. So currently we've defined Maximo as a system of record. And what would happen is you would click on the create GIS relationship or create update GIS, which will go ahead and create that object along with the relationship. So let's actually go and do that. So we'll go select layers. I'm going to pick schools because we haven't defined our schools yet. We'll click OK. Let's go find the schools. It always adds it to the bottom of the list. So we'll just go to the end. There's landmark schools. So here you can see nothing is filled in, so we'll just call this GIS_schools test. We'll define what type of record that we want to link it to from a Maximo perspective. So we may want to define schools as an asset, or we may want to define it as a location. In my case, I'll just define asset. I'll say the system of record is ArcGIS, and then I simply click on Execute GIS Configuration. By doing that, it'll display the attributes from the GIS system. I can define the attributes that I potentially would want to map or leverage. This will create the attributes in the Maximo object once it's created. Click OK. And then Maximo is now going out and creating the relationship. By default, it's 1 = 1. And then we can further refine that relationship and other information. So let's go back to our hydrants. So let me actually save this record. Let's bring up my hydrants. So in the hydrants, you can see that I've actually modified the relationship. What the relationship does is it maps a GIS attribute, in this case INV_ID, maps it to a Maximo attribute, TRH_asset num. So we're going to take the inventory ID that is defined in GIS and place it into the TRH asset num field in Maximo when we do a synchronization shortly. This is also used to help to project or render that particular feature on the map once we click on the asset in the map tab within an application. We can also see the GIS REST URL that's being used. So this is the URL and the feature service that it's connecting to. And if I wanted to update my relationship or update the information, I simply click on this create update. I can go new row, pick what my new attribute would be, pick my new target attribute, and my relationship will get updated. Okay, we'll take a look at another one. So again, I'll be using hydrants, and I'll be using park open spaces. Hydrants will be assets, and park open spaces will be locations. So here we can see that the GIS feature parent object is a location. I'm again mapping a GIS ID to a field in Maximo, which is TRH_location. Down at the bottom are also the JSON mapping linkages. So within Maximo 7.6, you now have the ability to synchronize data with your Esri GIS server. You will have an inbound, so that's from Esri to Maximo, as well as from Maximo to the GIS, which will be an outbound. In our particular scenario that we'll be walking through today, we'll be looking at an inbound, but similarly, you can do the same thing with an outbound. You would have to define the JSON mapping, which we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes. And once you define and create that JSON mapping, you would come back into the map manager and make that association. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the JSON mapping. So JSON mapping is an application that is now included with 7.6 that Maximo Spatial is leveraging. You'll get to the JSON mapping application by doing a go-to, integration, and JSON mapping. It is used to configure the mapping between the GIS attributes and the Maximo MBOs. It utilizes object structures. So those that are familiar with integrations in Maximo and object structures, this is again one of the other feature sets that when you create the GIS object, an object structure is created, and you can utilize that object structure so that you can map different objects and not just assets or locations. So out of the box structures are ArcGIS asset, ArcGIS location, and service address, as well as work orders. However, you can extend those objects and include other objects or other Maximo objects. For example, location hierarchy or meters and other data that may be applicable. The JSON mapping can be used again for both inbound and outbound processing. We'll be demonstrating the inbound processing. And then it also supports conditions in JavaScript. So as we define the JSON mapping, you can define conditions or you leverage JavaScript to potentially parse a string of attributes or values. The JSON mapping application is referenced by the map manager. So as you saw, as I just came out of the map manager application, you would then go back in and make that relationship between the map manager and the JSON mapping. To give you a perspective of how the JSON mapping is going to work, your Esri GIS contains a feature class, and then within that feature class, you have many attributes. So you'll have an object ID, you'll have a name, address type, status, jurisdiction. Again, depending on the type of feature class, you'll have one or more of these types or different types of attributes. The key is that you have the ability now to take that data from those attributes and map them to Maximo fields and consequently vice versa. So in this particular case, what we're showing you here is we have a number of fields that will get mapped to asset attributes. When we go into the JSON mapping, what you'll find is that when you're defining at the object level, so in this case, the asset object, you'll be defining many to one relationship. However, when we do the specifications, it's a one-to-one relationship. So for every attribute that you want to map to a specification in Maximo, it is one record. And again, when I go through the demonstration here in just a moment, it'll better illustrate that. So here's just an example of how we have a condition along on the status field or the status attribute, and a couple of things that we can do with this is we can perform a condition, and the condition being, based on a particular status in the GIS system, we can make it apply a particular status in Maximo. As well as we can concatenate a description. So we can do, for example, the GIS name plus any fields from the GIS to concatenate or define what the description of the asset will be. So let's go to the Map Manager application. So Map Manager, again, you will find under integration and JSON mapping. Hit enter. We got a number of different mappings. So typically you would come in, you would click on create a new mapping. When you create a new mapping, you will want to leverage or define the mapping based on the object that you're creating, and then if it's inbound or outbound, and then you define the directions, so inbound, outbound. You'll copy the REST URL that you define on the map service, and I've got my navigation collapse. You can copy it in here and then simply do a test mapping, and then this will link to the JSON document in the Esri GIS server demonstrating all the different fields that are available to you. Go to the properties, we'll just collapse this. And we'll zoom in a little bit just so that people can see a little bit better. All right, so there are a couple things that you would typically default or define when creating a JSON mapping. You define multiple processes. The first three are your standard processes in the sense that you define the object name, then you define the asset and then the feature you're going to link it with, and then really it's the third one here that becomes important, such that this is now where we're defining a feature and linking it to the asset attributes. And then later on we'll talk about the asset specs that we see coming up next. So from an asset perspective, this is the the many-to-one that I was talking about. We have many different attributes on the GIS side that we want to map to the Maximo system, as well as we have a number of attributes in the Maximo system that we are going to hard code or define manually. So some of those manual entries would be the +S feature class, right? So what is the feature class that's going to be defined inside of Maximo? We want to make sure that the +is_GIS field is enabled, so we're setting it to 1. Maybe we want to define a hierarchy path or a classification that is linked to that particular record, so we're hard coding that, and then we're also hard coding other fields such as an asset type and then this site ID. And you can do this with any fields in Maximo. We then have some conditional data. In this case, we have install date that is conditional data. We can see is conditional checked off. So if we go to the conditional values, we can see that we are bringing in some conditional data. So if it's equal to 0, then we're just going to null it out. However, if the install date is greater than 0, then we're going to bring in that install date, and Maximo will transform that date for you. We have another one here. We talked about briefly in the PowerPoint slides with the status. And with the status here, we have an abandoned status. So when the status is equal to abandoned, that will be decommissioned inside of Maximo. And when it's not equal to abandoned, then it'll be in an operating. Okay. Sorry, moved off the wrong one. So we've got 14 attributes. There is no limit or restriction to the amount of records that you display. What I do want to show you is that, again, there are a number of fields such as a street code, a municipality number, and maybe there might be some specific directions that that are being that are stored inside of GIS in order to provide the operator or the person looking at the data some more detailed information. So we're mapping all of that. So once you've done that, we then move on to the asset specification. So in asset specifications, again, we may be moving some specific data to the specifications linked to the classification. So this would be the specifications tab and the attributes in the specifications. So here we have a number of specifications now that we're passing, such as comments. So for specification, it is a one-to-one relationship. So for every attribute in GIS that you want to map to a classification specification, then you need to define one for each one. So here we're populating the block value from GIS into the asset attrib ID or attribute ID called block. So this is again how it's making that. Any fields that are required fields in the system also need to be, so linear is also installed. So in this case, we're not making that relationship to linear, so we're just defining that field to 0. So I've got a large number of attributes that we're generating and or passing information across. Quickly, we'll just go look at the parks and open spaces. And this one, similarly, the same thing. However, this one we are mapping to the locations as well as location specifications. But what I want to point out here is by default, the location hierarchy is not part of the object. So we simply leveraging the ability and extending it so that we can now link the location hierarchy for these assets that we are bringing in. It's important to maintain that hierarchy for those that are familiar with Maximo. And so by doing this, we can now ensure that that data quality in the hierarchy is maintained. So let's go take a look at these assets. So let's go to the assets application. So how would you synchronize this data? You would synchronize the data through a cron task. I'm going to leave that towards the end. Just reason being, from a time perspective, I think it's more important to look at what the data looks like versus a cron task that you would just define that runs on any interval to bring data in. So from a hydrant perspective, I'm selecting a hydrant. Okay. In this hydrant, it's been synchronized. I can see many of the fields at the asset level has been synchronized. So the block number, the street number, the street name. If you recall, I had a division that was being populated as well as a site and a sub-site, and then there's our identifier. So TRH underscore asset name in this particular instance is the asset identifier, and this is the field that's mapping. So we're just auto numbering assets in Maximo, but we're linking to the GIS by using the asset identifier number. If I go down, some other information that was populated was the installation date. So that was the installation date that was mapped from the GIS. If I move over to specifications, here we can see all the specifications. So that particular classification, if you recall, we had mapped the classification, now has 29 specifications, and all that data has been mapped from the GIS to Maximo. Now, if we jump over into the map and we look at the map, don't want to click on that one. I want to click on current asset, and then there's my current asset. So I'll just zoom out just so that people can get an appreciation. There's a system property in Maximo that defines your map persistence. So when I was last in the system, I was zoomed in, hence why it jumped automatically or directly to that particular view. So here's an example of the map. Here is the marker. So because this particular hydrant that I'm on is linked, it has highlighted or identified that. And similar to Maximo 7.5, I can jump to the next record, and Maximo will simply display the details of that record. If I left click on top of the marker, yeah, there it is. This dialog will pop up, and then I can have additional details. So I can look at the asset details, which will basically display for me the asset specifications. So this is like going to the asset spec tab. I can do a drill down, for those that are familiar with drill down, and I can view work details. So if I wanted to see any work orders that were performed on that hydrant or maybe currently open, I can quickly identify and see that directly from the map. I also have the ability to expand that map so that I lose all the maximal capabilities, and that's really when it becomes beneficial to have that data. Now, if I was in a different area than I'm currently looking at, I can hit the My Location. What that will do is that will use either the GIS capabilities that might be on the device that you're on. In this particular case, I'm on a Wi-Fi, so it's trying to leverage the Wi-Fi connection to find my location, and so there are different methods. And basically this little dot over here is the location that I'm in. I have the ability to print and export that data. Similarly in Maximo 7.6 or Spatial 7.6, you have the ability to query for specific data. So you would simply select your layer and then your fields that you want to and your operators. You can refresh the data at any time to get rid of that. One of the new features that's in 7.6 that 7.5 did not have is these dialogues are now movable. Yay. Before they used to be prefixed on the right-hand side. You have the ability to link additional data for that system. So here are some results. So I was doing some testing earlier, so I'm going to wipe out those results. And what I'm going to do now is use my selection tool. So you have a selection tool. And I'm going to say, grab me everything from around here. And it's going to go and pull in all that data. So we can see here the data. We'll just close this off. Better position that. We can see the data that's available to us. We can unselect everything. We can select the records that we want, and then we can leverage the maximal capabilities where we can identify or update the application list. So this will update the list view in Maximo with just those two records, or we can merge that the map data or merge the two in the system are some of the capabilities there. So we'll come back to that. You also have the ability to draw and measure. So this is similar capability into that was in the 7.5 release. That's now in 7.6. With the one new feature is you now have the ability to save this particular change, where in 7.5 you would lose that change. And lastly, you have the ability to control what layers you want to see. So currently I'm seeing my water layers. I can put on my street assets. I can put on my storm and sanitary, turn on recreation. I can turn certain things on and off. So obviously by enabling these, it makes the map more busier, but you have the ability to control that, as well as you have the ability, if I do this right, I'll uncheck that, but I can still check the right-hand side. Let me turn off some of these, and it'll still display that data. So a lot of flexibility in the layer definitions. Again, just restrict and watch how much data you put on, and then it'll display that. So we can see here we got a lot of recreational facilities that are available to us. So we'll just turn that off. Okay, so let's bring our window back down. I'm going to go back to the list view. And this time I'm going to search for one of our parks. Actually, I need to change the filter. So parks. Oop, I know why it's not coming up, because it's a location. Okay, so here we have a number of different parks and buildings related to that Richmond Green. So I'm going to go and pick this destination park. Again, fields have been integrated or synchronized between the two systems along with specifications. And because our assets are now tied to that park, we can see that there's actually 235 assets within this park or this destination park. So everything from baseball diamonds to basketball courts, soccer fields, you name it, we now have a link to that data. If I go over to specifications, again, there's only a couple of specifications for this particular one. Actually, I'll go back to location because I did talk about the hierarchy, and here we can see how the systems have been brought in as well as the hierarchy has been brought in, so that will help display that data from a Maximo perspective. If I go over to the map tab, and similar to assets, it will display it. We'll just click on it here so that it centers in the map, and then we'll zoom in. Oops, 1 sec here. Hit the wrong button. So let's go here, go back. All right, so there it is. You notice that you don't have the zoom in and zoom out. How you zoom in and zoom out is you either hit the shift and then you can drag and hold your mouse over it and then it'll zoom in. So this pink area is the destination park with all the soccer fields and basketball courts, baseball fields. If I click on the layers there, let's move this. Let's go to parks and open spaces, and let's turn on the turn that on, and we can see all the different soccer fields, baseball fields, and so forth. So what I'm going to do now is we'll do a selection. Okay, we got a selection, and what I'll do here is go here, and we'll do a create. There it is, create spatial work order. So similar to 7.5, you have the ability to create work orders from Maximo. It'll create it based on the selected records. We click on OK. And you want to go over that work order? Absolutely. Let's go take a look at that work order. So all the information, the location that we brought in, that's been copied over. And then if I go over to the map tab, Maximo there, you need to notice that it's automatically highlighted, and we'll just zoom in again. And there you go. That's where the work order is. So Maximo's created that relationship. So a lot of neat features and capabilities that you can do. Obviously not enough time to show it all. I do have a few other things that I wanted to cover. So let me just switch back to minimize this here. So how does that synchronization work? The synchronization works leveraging a Cron task. So there is a single Cron task app, that is set up. So you go to the Cron task application, and there is a Cron task, an out-of-the-box Cron task called ArcGIS Data Sync. Shipped out of the box is 3 Cron task instances that you can use to define either an asset sync, a location sync, or a service address sync. So it gives you the ability or a template that you can use. My suggestion is never use the new row, use the duplicate function so that it copies all the applicable parameters. There are a number of parameters that you will need to specify. One will be the GIS object name. This is the name that you define in the map manager when you created the GIS object. You'll need to pass the URL and when you pass the URL, again, you can copy paste from the map manager and the JSON data. The number of requests that can be sent to the GIS server to get data, and then a process flag. So you have the ability to change a state. So for example, MX creation state, you would change a flag or a field to indicate that Maximo has synchronized that, so that if the data ever changes, the user or the editor might change that field back so that the cron task knows to pull that data in or synchronize that data in again. And then one of the other changes is the map manager. So map manager, not map manager, the map itself within the application. So we saw the map in the asset locations, work order application. It's also available in service requests and service addresses. The map has controls that you can enable from within the application designer. You can define the width and the height, the latitude, longitude. You can change the marker image. So if you don't like the little shield that was popping up, you can change the marker image. And you have a lot of other controls that you can do and select. So I'll demonstrate that now. Not that one. All right, so here we'll go back to locations. And let's go to cron task. So here's the ArcGIS data sync that I mentioned. With this one, again, there are 3 that are provided. Asset sync is one of them, and then we simply duplicated the other records, one for each object structure. So for demonstration purposes, let's pick our hydrant. And then if we look at our parameters, we have 8 parameters. So the service name, the external system to use, the GIS object name. So again, we link this GIS object to what we created to define a map manager, the number of requests to process. Here's the flag that we're updating. So again, once Maximo processes this record, it'll change the MX creation state to a value of 2. And then we have a split tag, which is features, which we don't have to worry about. And then we have the URL. So you can simply take this URL. This is your Esri ArcGIS URL. And you should be able to put that in and it'll return back. So that's what we saw earlier with the JSON data. Now, one of the things I guess we can mention is right here on this URL, I've got a where 1 equals 1. If you like, you can also do a substitution and maybe put a where clause on there to say where modified date, or where a specific color or specific criteria is met in order to reduce the data that you're synchronizing. So you would simply update the where clause in the URL, and then you would just copy and paste it back into the cron task and execute that cron task. And the last thing I wanted to show you was the application designer. So this one got me when rolled out Maximo Spatial, trying to figure out how I configure the toolbar within the map. We'll go to the map tab here. So here's a map section. And if I click on the map properties, I can define what the height is. I can define the default latitude, longitude to use. Again, my preference is to use the one from the site in the map manager. And then here are the toolbar items. So there are a number of toolbar items. We got 25 of them. Some of them are TPA, or typically process automation engine, the core Maximo. Some are provided by Maximo Spatial. So you simply go through and select the items that you want to display on the toolbar. So there are a number of different items that you can turn on and off and play with, and as well as you can refresh the map, maybe every 60 seconds or every 60 minutes if you want. Okay, so don't forget about that. And then you can have the ability to create your own widgets inside of Maximo Spatial. So if you create your own widget, it will get added to that field. Just to give you an example of one, I'm just going to pick a work order here. Go to the service address. You'll notice my service address doesn't have a latitude and a longitude. So if I go over the map tab, I'm going to use the my location. So I'm going to tell Maximo, tell me where I am. So based on, again, my GPS coordinates, maybe I want to report a pothole, or maybe I'm doing a route patrol or road patrol or a sidewalk patrol, maybe walking through a trail, and I want to identify, a deficiency with that particular area that I'm at, and I want to record the latitude and longitude. So I simply hit this my location. Again, that will use the GPS coordinates on your device, and then I can hit save my location, and the coordinates are updated. So what that simply does, it's a widget that we added for this particular case. We added it for people that are doing the route patrols, sidewalk patrols, trails, that they can then track the latitude and longitude of where they are. So that's a widget that can be added very easily into Maximo, exposed to the map application, and then based on certain data, in this case leveraging the GPS on the device, populating the latitude and longitude. So those were all the things that I wanted to demonstrate today. Obviously touched on a little varying of different capabilities within the Spatial 7.6. There's definitely a lot more that we could get into, but at this point in time, I'm going to pass it back to Brian and open it up for questions. So if you do have any questions, please post them in the chat, and then Brian will communicate those questions to me.